All right. Sam, just let me know if you can see my slide there. Secure microservices. All right.
Yeah, coming across. There you are.
What do you see now?
I see your secure microservices and then my glorious name. You can make my name bigger and in glitter, but apart from that, it's looking pretty good.
All right, good. Yeah, I couldn't have an image to show you. Okay, we've got 10 attendees joining, so welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm just going to ask a small favour of anybody who's listening to ping me a message if you can actually hear me, which is going to be weird if you can't hear me because then obviously you'll ping me no message. But I just want to do a bit of a flight check. Let me look at the questions. Oh.
Yeah, we've got a question. Thank you very much, Eugene, for helping us out here. It's always good to check the AV before you get started. It's like dry running a production deployment.
It's not the AV that I'm worried about. It's Go. It's the Go Webinar control panel. All right, good.
Don't click the wrong button, mate.
No. All right. Okay, so welcome to everybody who's joining. As you can see, there are the people are sort of coming in now and logging onto the webinar. So we'll just ask people to be patient while the rest of the participants join us. Once we get up to sort of more or less full strength, I'll give a short introduction, and then Sam will take over and take you through his webinar, which will be about secure microservices. For those of you who are new to the GoToWebinar software, it is possible to ask questions and we will answer them throughout the webinar, so please do take advantage of that functionality. It's not unusual for GoToWebinar to crash, so please be aware of that. It occasionally even happens to us, in which case we get an embarrassing 30 seconds blackout. Although last time, Sam, your laptop actually died in the middle of the webinar, didn't it?
Yeah, let's hope that life doesn't repeat itself. So last time I did one of these, my laptop completely died halfway through due to what I was later told was water damage. And so yeah, it was a complete shut off. So I am staying well away from my laptop. I'm as in I've got no liquids near it. So touch wood, all should be well.
Okay, maybe it was all the perspiration because you were so nervous about speaking.
Yeah, probably just being unclear with my yeah.
So I think we're getting close to full strength, so I'm going to probably start in about a minute. I also heard from my colleagues over in Germany and the Netherlands that there's a number of Container Solutions people who have logged in to watch this webinar, so hello, welcome if it's your first one. Yeah, if you're new to Container Solutions, you'll be doing your first webinar in about 3 weeks, so get ready for that.
So maybe just to set the scene, Jamie, you're going to do a bit of an intro to things, and then I'm going to be doing about a presentation for about half an hour, talking a bit about microservice security, and then the idea is we'll leave the rest of the time is for your questions. So I've got about half an hour presentation, but I'll answer questions as I go. So please do ask questions as you go. That'd be great.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, Sam, if you've got, if it's okay with you, Sam, I'll get cracking now and I'll start going through these introductory slides.
All right, let's go for it.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody on the webinar. Thank you for your patience as the last of the attendees come online. Today we're going to be talking about secure microservices. This is a little bit of a follow-on from Adrian's talk about Docker security and container security last time. The following webinar will be about Kubernetes and thereafter production-grade Kubernetes. So there's a little bit of continuity in the webinars and the things we've been teaching and talking about recently. So the agenda for today is I'll make a quick, I'll spend a moment explaining what Container Solutions are, what we do, etc. Then there's some announcements. I'll mention the handouts briefly, a little bit about the protocol, and then we'll move over to Sam's webinar. As Sam was just saying, ping us questions within the webinar if you like, or otherwise wait till the end and we'll try to answer any questions you have at that point. So about Container Solutions. Container Solutions, I've gone forward a slide. Container Solutions are a professional services firm. So we specialize in cloud native computing, so distributed systems, containerized microservices. But a big part of what we do is cloud migration. So how do you start in your own data center and how do you begin to move to the public cloud? And when you make that move, how do you containerize your applications to get the most value for money from your cloud offering? And as we'll find out in this webinar, how do you secure those microservices? Container Solutions operate globally. We have a lot of distributed teams. And so that's what we do. And so if you need any help around professional services in this stuff, just give us a shout. Okay, some announcements. KubeCon is coming up. So KubeCon's a really nice conference that's happening in London. Container Solutions are running the technical ethics track. This is something that is very dear to our hearts. We are trying to raise the level of awareness about the work we do and the effects that large engineering projects have on wider society. So our colleague Anne will be running that. And the developer experience track is going to be about feedback loops, how developers can become productive, and I'm going to be hosting that. So both of these tracks are important to us. We're going to have a booth there, so if you want to come and say hello, just send us an email at qcom@containersolutions.com and we can set up a meeting and we can hang out and stuff like that. KubeCon is coming up. So this is May the 2nd to the 4th in Copenhagen. So for those people who are really interested in the stuff we'll be talking about today and Kubernetes, that's going to be happening in Copenhagen. KubeCon is part of the CNCF, which is a non-profit organization that incubates a lot of the tools and basically helps advances the cloud native mission. There's going to be some announcements from us around some of the open source tools we've been building, so please watch out for that. Webinars and trainings. I'll drop a few links into the box as the conversation and the webinar continues, but basically we've got another couple of webinars coming up after this one, but we also have some really advanced training courses around Kubernetes, around secure microservices, which is a training course that Sam has designed and delivers himself. And you can click on the link shown in the PDF or in the slides, and they will take you through to the website so you can get more information about these courses. There's a 20% discount for people who attend these webinars. It's a good incentive to get people onto the webinars. If you use that discount code there, that will be active right until the sale closes for the training courses. Here are the webinars. I'm not going to go through these. You can check them out on the website, but the links are in the PDF so you can take a look later. I will say one thing. Both of the following webinars are almost full. So we would encourage people to sign up because if you don't sign up, then unfortunately, I think GoToWebinar can only handle 100 attendees. So to avoid disappointment, please sign up while you can. Well, Etienne's webinar's already happened. Sorry about that. I should have taken that link out. We're hiring. Just a quick shout out about Container Solutions. We're looking for people in Amsterdam, in Zurich, in London. Our office is that huge rocket ship. So please give us a shout if you're interested in working with us. Pretty distinct career paths at Container Solutions. It's an organisation that helps people to get to where they want to be in terms of their careers. Good coaching, excellent management structure, etc., etc. So ping us an email at jobs@containersolutions.com if you're interested in applying, and we'll give you some more information. And without much further ado, we can now think about switching to the webinar. You will see in the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a number of handouts. Some of them, one of them is Sam's deck. The other one is this deck, so you can follow the links. There's a little bit more information about the Discovery product family, and of course about Sam's secure microservice course. So please use the links, download the PDFs, and without much more messing about, I'm going to hand over to Sam Newman. Sam is a very experienced software practitioner. He wrote, probably the most famous book about microservices. It's an excellent book, so I would recommend that. And he's going to now take us through secure microservices. Okay, Sam, I'm going to hand over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. I'm just going to take over as presenter and I'll start sharing my screen. So as Jamie said, we are, we're sort of I work with Container Solutions and a bunch of things, and one of the things we're putting together is a 2-day training course. Myself and Adrian is the chief scientist from Container Solutions and sort of an expert in the area of Docker security. We sort of do a double header course where I look at things from the architecture point of view, looking at how we sort of design systems, think about security from the architecture side of things, and then Adrian goes like down almost quite low level actually into sort of how you actually apply some of those ideas in actually securing Docker as one way of implementing a microservice deployment platform. What I'm going to do today is really share with you some highlights from that training course. It's not a lot of detail. I'm not going to go hugely detailed on this. We've only got 30 minutes, but I want to give you a bit of an overview in terms of how I think about security in the context of microservices, and give you a few take-home things that you might make sense to you, might make you want to come to the course, or might make you want to do your own reading and research. As Jamie said, these slides are all available in the download section on the GoToMeeting. You should have all have access to that stuff. Please do ask questions as we go. I'll make sure I check in there every now and then. Okay, so yeah, so as Jamie mentioned, I actually run my own company called Sam Newman and Associates. So we actually work offering consultancy, advisory work. I do sort of mentoring for tech leads and architects and things like that. Do training courses and the sorts, but all kinds of work. If you want to know more, you can ping me offline. And I also wrote a book called Building Microservices. Actually, the chapter on security was the first chapter I wrote for that book. Now things have moved on. It's been about 3 years since I wrote that book. I'm actually working on a second edition now. And so actually I'm in the process of pulling back a lot of new information around security that's going to make it into the second edition of Building Microservices. And some of those things I'll be touching on today. But we're here to talk about microservices. You've probably heard loads about them. You're probably thinking, isn't this old hat by now? But it turns out some people still use them. And if you've ever seen one of my presentations, I describe them in this way: small, sort of independently deployable services that work together, modeled around a business domain. So we're looking at breaking apart how we solve problems into smaller, independently deployable units. These are typically separate processes that communicate with each other over networks. Often they're deployed onto containerized platforms because that makes it much more cost effective and efficient to run these things in isolated ways, deploying onto Kubernetes or other orchestration platforms, but you can also be hand rolling this stuff. But the key thing is these are separate processes that are communicating with each other over networks. Now, when it comes to security, this opens up some really interesting possibilities for us, because when we have a sort of a single monolithic system, we sort of have all of our processing and all of our data is in one place, right? I mean, we quite literally, well, not quite literally, we almost literally have all of our eggs in one basket. And that can be a problem when it comes to security, because all of our data, our most sensitive data and our least sensitive data, for example, is all living in the same database. Our most sensitive and least sensitive processing is all living in the same process space. That means we sort of have to, from a security standpoint, you almost need to secure everything as though the most important thing is being looked after. You can waste a lot of your time just trying to get your head around, well, it's this big thing, right? So how do I think about this from a security standpoint? With the microservice architecture, you really do get to focus in on things. You can look at a service in isolation and think, what does this service need? What is the information that's flowing in and out of this service? What is the data that this service itself stores? And this can be really useful because you can totally focus your attention on one particular area, or perhaps the set of services that handle the most important data that you have. This can be really useful when you start looking at things like personally identifiable information. Some of you might be working in parts of the world where things like the General Data Protection Regulation is coming to force. This is sort of being rolled out in the UK and elsewhere. It's actually an EU diktat, which sort of changes how we think about data protection. One of the things you need to be able to do is actually know where data lives, which, believe it or not, is not something a lot of organizations can handle. How do I know where my data is to be able to scrub information out if I want to implement things like the right to be forgotten? That's actually quite a complex thing potentially with more monolithic systems, because you've just so much data you don't know where to look. But with a microservice system, you can focus your attention on those areas that contain PII. Those areas can get more oversight, more attention. You can also enact different kinds of protections around those services. You can segment those services on different, different networks, different VLANs. You can apply multiple perimeter protections, defending against different types of attacks. You have multiple points at which to defend your systems, and defense in depth is actually a key part of delivering a sort of a secure system. We're going to touch on that a bit later on. So these are all the good things associated with microservices and security. The problem, of course, is that, well, there's also some bad side. All that information that used to flow within a process on a single monolithically processed system now flows over networks. And that's difficult, right? That's problematic because those are networks and that's traffic that can be sniffed, that can be manipulated. Information that I used to just implicitly, I knew that the only way that an outside party could gain access to it was by accessing that process itself, maybe running things like memory resident malware, which is quite a sophisticated attack. Now suddenly that information is flowing over networks between services. And that's information that could be being sent in the open, whether we realize it or not. We also have multiple different parts of our system that need to be looked after and managed well. Any one of those services is a potential weak spot where an attacker may be able to gain access. So on the one hand, with a microservice architecture, we've given ourselves many more options in how we defend our applications and in terms of how we really think about our application security. And I think in some degrees it can simplify our job. On the other hand, we've increased the surface area of attack. And so this is what leads me to believe that I think an organization, a team that is more knowledgeable about security, I think they can actually make a more secure application using a microservice architecture. On the other hand, I think a team that's got maybe a more naive approach towards security could potentially end up with a much less secure application than they might otherwise have been able to build, taking a more monolithic approach. Now we're going to dive into looking at some of the challenges associated with microservice security and specifically how we can defend against them. And I'm going to give you sort of a few just key examples of problem areas that you might want to think about. But I also want to share with you a model for how I think about application security that some old colleagues at ThoughtWorks came up with that I quite like using. The idea here is, I think, with security all too often, especially with those engineers amongst us, we tend to fixate a bit too much on just this thing, the prevention, stopping the bad thing from happening, stopping a malicious party gaining access to data, gaining access to our system. But we shouldn't think about that in isolation. We also have to understand, well, how do we know if something bad has happened? How do we know if our systems have been breached, if data has been stolen? And once we know whether or not that's happened or not, how do we respond to that? This is stuff that's often much softer. These are around people-related aspects, but how do we respond to that? And once we've responded, how do we recover from that process? How do we recover our systems and bring our systems back up and get them running again? So I'm going to do a brief tour of all of these. We'll spend a bit more time in prevention purely because it's sort of the deepest space in a way, especially when it comes to the differences between, say, a microservice-based system versus a more traditional monolithic-based deployed system. So let's start talking about prevention. Now, many years ago, I was working for an organization. This was actually just post the Snowden revelations. And this organization, as a result of that, had decided to take a different stance towards application security. They wanted to actually be a lot tighter on that, have a better awareness of the value of data, and have a lot more confidence in the stance they were taking around privacy of their clients' information. And so it created an information security team. And that organization, that team within that larger organization, was starting to look at the organization as a whole and think, okay, what are the things that we need to do to protect our organization? And one of the very first things they said was, well, look, we've got lots of offices around the world, but we have no idea who's coming in and out of our offices. And that's a problem because if anything happens, we don't know who may have caused a problem. We're not deterring people from gaining access to our buildings. And they thought, well, what we'll do is we're going to set up some CCTV cameras and effectively put like a closed circuit television camera in the foyer of our offices. The idea being that if something happens, we've got at least a chance of knowing what might have happened. Did someone gain access to our physical networks by pretending to be, I don't know, a flower delivery person, for example? Now, this caused a bit of a storm inside that particular organization because people started being concerned about their own privacy and felt that this InfoSec team was overreaching themselves, that they actually was about spying on the employees as well. And this firestorm kicked off for a few weeks. until somebody said, actually, well, hang on a minute, we want to spend thousands of pounds setting up CCTV cameras, but actually the office where I work in Melbourne, the front door doesn't close properly. So literally people would go home, they'd lock up, they thought they were locking up, set them for the alarm, they'd come in the next day and found that the lock hadn't latched properly, the door was actually could be pushed wide open. And this has been the case for years. Now, if you're thinking about protecting your premises, clearly there's a lot more value in making sure your front door lock works than actually installing CCTV cameras. But human beings aren't necessarily always good at making valued assessments. It also turned out that employing a locksmith to fix the lock costs about $100, which is a lot more than setting up an IP-based CCTV system. As a result of this, we have a whole load of techniques as a result of our human beings' inability to rationally assess risk. And we have a whole load of models in the space of application security to help us think rationally about what are the risks that our systems are vulnerable to and what should we do about it. One technique, which is often used as part of wider frameworks, is called attack trees. Now, attack trees are a really simple idea that Bruce and I came up with back in the late 90s. And the idea is really, it's almost like a brainstorming exercise. And what you do is you start off with some sort of outcome that a malicious party is trying to achieve. So in this particular example, the malicious party is attempting to gain access to our safe. We've got lots of money in our safe and we're obviously concerned about it. So what you start doing is you start enumerating the different ways in which they could gain access to the safe. Well, the first thing they could do is they could pick the lock. Okay, the next thing, what else could they do? Well, they could learn the combination. Seems quite fair. Yeah, someone could have written that down. We might be able to get that. They could also cut the safe open. All right, we'll keep going. How could they learn the combination? Well, they could find that combination written down, or they could get a combination from the target. The target sounds, it's all very Jason Bourne, it's all very cloak and dagger at this point. How could I get the information from the target? Well, I could blackmail someone, I could threaten them, I could bribe them. It's very quickly when you start doing any application security, you start doing threat modeling exercises like this, you realize that a large amount of the threats that you're vulnerable to are often through soft, human factors and human vectors. So in this example, we've got a whole load of space here, which isn't about the technology. You could argue the safe in this is the technology, the quality of the lock, how hard it is to cut open our technology aspects. But someone writing a combination written down, that's very much of a human being type thing. And I'm sure some of us have worked in workplaces where we've seen passwords written down in the past. Once you've enumerated this, you start putting weights on these things. And what you're trying to assess here is the difficulty, the relative difficulty of an attacker using that vector to gain access in a situation to the safe. And often the goal in security engineering is not to make something impossible. It's actually just to make it so expensive that it's no longer economically viable for a malicious party to use that attack mechanism. The classic example of that would be using very, very long keys, very long encryption keys to encrypt data. Theoretically, you can brute force something with a very long encryption key, but it requires such a long time or so many computing resources that the value of the information you gain access to is far lower than the amount of money you'll have to spend cracking that key in the first place. And so once you've done this assessment, you can start seeing relatively, okay, well, where are we vulnerable? Where, therefore, are we best placed to spend our effort in protecting our system? And so I think the very first thing I'd say is, especially if you're in an organization that has that does sorts of processing where they believe you might have some sensitivity around security, is actually to have some kind of threat modeling exercise purely to start getting a really rational sense of where are you vulnerable. But let's push on and look at a sort of an example system. And if you've read my book or some of the presentations, I often use this sort of fake domain of a music shop, a cutting-edge music shop, which is selling CDs online. There's clearly a business that's going to go big any day now. And so in this example, we just got 4 services: a user service where we sort of store our PII, our personally identifiable information. We've got a music web shop, which is serving up our front-end website, a catalog, which retrieves information about the CDs we sell, and a streaming backend, which is where we connect to a streaming party and a royalty party. So we stream music through this service, but you also have to pay royalty information based on that as well. And these services all communicate with each other and live on our premises. And we have both a native and a web-based client that we talk to, and we have a third party we communicate with where we send the streaming information. So everything in that box is sort of our site and our system. So as I touched on before, one of the very first things we have to look at is the fact that a lot of information that used to flow within a process now flows over networks. We have to actually think about data in transit and how information flows between services. And here really your sort of concerns come down to four things when you were thinking about this. And so when we're looking at mechanisms to help protect our data in transit, we kind of have to think about all four of these things. The first thing is do we allow an unauthorized party to observe the flow of information so they can actually see what's being sent? Secondly, do we allow them to manipulate that data? There are some mechanisms that will stop the data being manipulated, but will still send that data in the open. A great example of that would be something like HBAC, for example. Next, do we actually restrict access to the endpoints? By this, I mean my mail services. You know, you've created a microservice that's designed to be called by other microservices. But do you do anything to stop a malicious party that has access to your network also gaining access to that service and making calls directly? And finally, and this is something which is a little bit more, which is a much rarer attack vector, but actually luckily it's fairly easy to protect against, is how do you go about stopping malicious parties impersonating endpoints, impersonating services? For example, someone might gain access to your service, spin up their own process that pretends to be one of the other services in your system, and they can gain access to all kinds of useful information at that point. Believe it or not, these are the kinds of attack vectors you have to think about. That last one is quite out there, but nonetheless, when you're looking at mechanisms to protect your services, you kind of want to at least have a think holistically about all the challenges you might face. Let's start with something really, really straightforward and really, really easy. And a solution that often gets raised at this point. Let's talk about something like HTTPS everywhere. Now, I want to be clear that you don't have to use HTTP to communicate between services. It's a common approach. People like building REST-based services or using RPC over HTTP mechanisms like SOAP or gRPC. And so it is common, but you don't have to use HTTP to build microservices. But if you do, you might want to take advantage of at least making use of HTTPS to provide some guarantees around how your services are communicated with. This has become a lot easier to implement. You've got things like Let's Encrypt, which is a free certificate authority. People, when Let's Encrypt will issue you a certificate, your SSL certificates for free. I think people often get fixated on the fact that they made this stuff free. That's actually not the most important or interesting thing. With Let's Encrypt, it's actually a second bit automated. So they've given you an automated way of issuing certificates, and so they make it quite easy for you to actually have services that are now communicating with each other over HTTPS. And that could make a good default choice to set up inside your perimeter. It's absolutely something that you can automate now. Now, you have to be clear about what HTTPS gives you. Now, what HTTPS does, assuming you're using proper certificates, you're actually signing them and checking them correctly, what it does is it gives you guarantees that the service you're talking to really is the service you're talking to. So it stops that impersonation problem. It also stops man-in-the-middle attacks. It stops your data itself from being manipulated. One of the key things it doesn't do anything about, though, is any client-side validation. So there's nothing to stop an unauthorized client talking to one of your services if all you're doing is routing your traffic over HTTPS. Now, other things that we could talk about at this point, but we could talk about API key management systems. That's something I go into in the wider course. But the next option that often comes up here is, okay, well, why don't we then add on some form of client-side certificate? So in this situation, when these two services are talking to each other, we have some sort of certificate that the client has access to. And so and so that is used to sign the request. The user service in this example here will say, okay, I know that request has actually come from a valid client because they've clearly got access to that certificate. And so in that world, we're using, say, TLS for both client and server-based authentication. You get a stronger guarantee that there's trust between these two things. And you also get guarantees around the data when it's being manipulated. And that's quite a useful system at that point. The real big problem here is that the management around client-side certificates is is more problematic to, typically than managing server-side certificates. And that's because often you have many more clients. You have to deal with revocation of those certificates and how you roll those sorts of things out. When you're managing all of the moving parts yourself, this can get kind of annoying, actually. And there are lots of complex systems I've seen set up to do this. People using things like Puppet and Chef to roll out client-side certificate management, home rolling your own PKI infrastructure. None of that's much fun. There are, if you're on a cloud platform, there are some other options available to you out there, though. For example, Amazon have their API gateway. With the API gateway, you can actually use API gateways to manage client-side certificates for you. So your services themselves aren't worrying about that, and that's being handled for you inside the API gateway. And Microsoft have similar supports with their with their own API gateways. And actually, I think in some ways it's a bit slicker than the stuff I've been seeing with Amazon. So here you can set up client-side certificate management that's managed for you all within the Azure platform. So if you're already on one of those two platforms, this is something you could already get handled for you and can be fully automated. And that's lowering the barrier significantly to really good client and server-based trust mechanisms. The problem when it comes to sort of, and so this is, in this situation here, for example, I might be using that inside my perimeter, but I'm definitely going to want to use a client-side certificate when talking out over the public internet. So even if I had to configure these things manually, I might be considering whether or not I'm going to have a manual, maybe a manual gateway set up with a royalty code in this example, and set up the certificate such that there's that communication is protected. Obviously, if I had a fully automated solution, that lowers the cost of rolling that solution out, and then I might choose to use client certificates inside my perimeter as well. But even if I only had things manually done, had to do it all by hand, which is not much fun, I may still consider doing it for things where I'm sending very sensitive information over the public internet. Now, the reality is that what we've talked about so far is really just about sort of, computers talking to other computers and how we establish trust and how we establish whether or not that information could be sniffed. And that's useful stuff. That's a building block. But we have to look a bit beyond that and think about the wider context in which authorization and authentication happens. So if we think about our current system, it's probably quite straightforward to consider a standard mechanism for user authentication. So in this scenario, I've got both my native mobile application and my web-based application. I've got my human being who's authenticating themselves with the system. So they're logging in via different protocols probably. So on the web, I'm going to be making use of some form of basic HTTP authentication. And that's all pretty straightforward. So form-based auth, and probably what I've got is some kind of authorization gateway, something on the head that runs on the edge of my perimeter that will look at traffic coming in and says, is this traffic coming from authenticated client? So maybe looking for the presence of a session cookie is a classic example of that, and handling that redirection flow. If not, and if so, passing it through and tracking. And with mobile, of course, we typically talk about some OAuth-based mechanism, typically an OAuth 2 flow, something like OpenID Connect. So both of these are very different mechanisms for different cases, but they're doing fundamentally the same thing. They're saying, is this person the person they claim they are? And giving the services, the system itself, an understanding about who that person is. And by making use of some kind of authenticating gateway, we can ensure that only authenticated users are actually gaining access to our system. Some people I've spoken to, they actually embed this sort of authentication, handshake, and redirection flow. They actually embed that in the services themselves and run their services themselves directly on the perimeter. I would say it's as common for people to actually have a full gateway appliance that sits in front that can also do things like single sign-on across all those services. So that's okay, that's fairly straightforward, and I think we're all on the same page here. But really what we've talked about here is authentication, not authorization. And you have to separate those two worldviews. Authentication talks about is the person who they say they are. Authorization then says, can the person do what they're trying to do? And they do have to be treated in different ways. So let's take a look at authorization. So let's think about a very simple scenario. We've got a user who comes onto our website and says, hi, I'm Bob. And our website says, okay, really, I need you to log in and really clearly prove you are Bob. So it pops up a little form and we fill in some details and Bob types his password in and the authorization gateway goes, yep, that's the right password. I now trust that you are Bob, and so I'm going to give you access now to the music web shop. So that now means you get your nice home page rendered and you can start doing things with your account or whatever that might be. So then Bob comes along and says, well, look, I'm going to actually access my information, but now it says, okay, I'm logged in as Bob, and what I actually want to do now is see my information. I want to see my details, information about me. So maybe I've clicked on my user profile link on my webpage, right? So it sent me off this URL, so /users/Bob, okay? And so I made that request. The authorization gateway has said, well, you're logged in as Bob, so I know you're authenticated. So I'm just going to pass that request down to the Music Web Shop. The Music Web Shop knows implicitly if something's come from the authorization gateway that they're authenticated. And at this point, it says, okay, you want your user details? Well, I don't actually handle your user details. Your user details are actually handled by a downstream service called the user service in this example. So what I'm going to do is I want to go and fetch the information you want. And so the Music Web Shop goes to the user service and says, hi, can I have Bob's details? Now, at this point, we might imagine that we've got some kind of client server based authentication going on. So in other words, we may actually be making use of something like client-side certificates. The Music Web Shop has a client-side certificate. When it makes a call to user service, the user service is able to say, I know you're the Music Web Shop because you're contacting me in the correct way. I know you've got a certificate because I can check the signature and everything looks good. So you're definitely the music shop, and I trust you as the music shop. So of course, here is Bob's information. The Music Web Shop then uses Bob's information to create the new page and sends that back to Bob. So Bob has access to their details, and the world is a happy, happy place. In this world, we effectively have a level of implicit trust, and really, we've not had any authorization strictly going on here. We've just said, well, look, if a user's logged in, they can request their information, and implicitly that feels okay. But let's push this a little bit more. So I'm still, new scenario, I'm still logged in as Bob, but now rather than asking for my information, I ask for somebody else's user information. And so here, maybe I'm being a bit naughty and I handcraft a different request. So I say, well, can I have Alice's information? So I go to the auth gateway, and the auth gateway, as far as it's concerned, I'm logged in, right? So that's good. So off that request goes to the Music Web Shop, and the Music Web Shop says, okay, well, you're logged in. You must be asking sensible things. So can I have Alice's details? And the user service goes, well, I trust you. You're the Music Web Shop, so of course you can have Alice's details. And here's Alice's details. And oh dear, I've leaked Alice's details to Bob. Now, this is actually a simple example of what's called the confused deputy problem. In other words, what we've done is this is a sort of a generic type of security issue. But it comes up more in microservices systems because we have this issue where services call services to carry out their tasks. And effectively what's happened up here is an upstream party, in this case our web browser, maliciously or not, has crafted a request that tricks the intermediary, the web shop in this example, into asking for information it really shouldn't be asking for and giving access to that. And the reason this problem occurs is because the web shop itself doesn't necessarily know what the downstream services should or shouldn't allow. And the downstream services don't have enough information about the person making the request to decide if they should grant it or not. We're just getting straightforward HTTP calls. What we would like to do is give additional information to the downstream services about the nature of the call being made such that they can make more nuanced decisions. In this situation, the user service just knowing who was actually making the request would be really beneficial, because then the user service could set up rules locally about what users can see what other users' details. There are a number of different ways of solving this, but one of the most elegant solutions that's being used quite a bit is to make use of JWT tokens. So JWT tokens are a really quite straightforward technology in the face of it, but be really, really useful. So JWT tokens are a way of basically representing claims in a JSON format and those claims can be passed around, like as a JSON token or a JOT token. And those you can validate whether or not those claims are true, and actually get information out of those claims that can be quite useful. So I'll give you a really, really simple example. So here I've got a simple JSON structure, and this says this is the ID of the user and the name of the user. And so you can imagine that what you might do as part of your authentication flow is you log that user in and you pass back a JSON structure like that, giving information about the user. So it could be your username, and maybe if you're using some sort of group or role-based permissioning, you might put in the groups that this user is in as well. What you can then do is you basically you can either fully encrypt the whole payload or just come up with effectively a hash of this payload, sort of like HMAC, which gives you something that looks like this. And this is something which services are able to interrogate, and they can look at that hash and say, yes, actually, by using basically a public key validation, can say, yes, this was a correctly encoded JOT token. Therefore, I know this JOT token is valid and hasn't been manipulated, hasn't been made up. And so I trust this JOT token is true. You have to deal with how you handle those keys. That's sort of a separate problem. We could explore it separately. But then I can actually say, not only is it valid, I can now pull additional information out of that. So thinking about how that might work as part of our login flow. So back to our situation where Bob is trying naughty things. When they log in this situation, what we actually create is we create a JOT token. And in that JOT token, we might just have simple enough saying user is Bob. And that's all it says. And so when the call gets made to the Music Studio Web Shop, we pass that token downstream. That token is typically going to be passed around maybe in a header of a HTTP call. The Music Web Shop doesn't know any differently. It can't necessarily make choices about what it should and shouldn't do on behalf of downstream services. Really want the downstream service to make that judgment call. So that token gets passed downstream saying, can I have Alice's details? And at that point, the user service looks at the JOT token, validates it, pulls out the information, says the user's Bob, and goes, no way. I only let Alice see Alice's details and Bob see Bob's details. So that's just a real quick overview of how these things work. And it's really nice that the tokens can be validated in the service. There's no need for expensive round trips. Let's talk briefly now about detection. So again, there's a few basic things that you want to be doing here. One of the first things is making use of all these additional perimeters you've got to look at things like intrusion detection systems, application firewalls, things like mod proxy. You've got often those types of tools can be quite complicated set up because you're trying to set them up for general purpose things. With a microservice architect, you can of course target those configurations on a service by service basis. It makes it much easier to set up what looks like sensible calls. So you can do those sorts of things. Even stuff like logging is really useful in the context of security. So I'm sure probably many of you are familiar with the idea of log aggregation. The idea that we collect all the information from those services and store it in some kind of log aggregation tool, like allows you to see all your logs in one place. And you can do complicated things like attaching alerts if you want to. One of the really valuable things here, of course, if the service vanishes, you've still got access to the logging information, even if that service is no longer there. The reason this is really useful in the context of security is purely because often when you're trying to understand whether or not you've been impacted by a security breach, different attacks will often leave footprints in the logs. Sometimes those attacks will try and scrub logs out after the fact to hide their footprints. That's something that's to an extent mitigated if those logs have already been moved off the machine before they're scrubbed. Different types of attack, like the shell shock attack from 2014, which made use of a vulnerability in the bash shell, would leave fingerprints in log files, and those things can be investigated after the fact. And so security professionals will often make use of log aggregation systems to track down whether or not you've been impacted by these things. One thing to say is often the kinds of log retention that you want from a security standpoint are often quite different to what a typical application developer or operations person will need. So I remember last time I was a chief architect inside ThoughtWorks for a while. We only, from an operations point of view, really needed to keep logs for a couple of months at most for diagnostic purposes and troubleshooting. But from a security point of view, we kept logs for 5 years. So typically, just to allow us a big window which to go back and investigate what had happened if we find out about things subsequently. And so we stored those actually, so we'd have a live log aggregation system, which had sort of a sliding window of the most up-to-date stuff. And then we sort of shipped the rest of that information off as well. I had a question actually just come in. From Pepin, I think it was. Would you recommend encrypting JWT tokens? So with a JWT token, you have actually encrypting the token is sort of an optional thing. Now, the thing to understand, of course, is if you don't encrypt the JWT token, you have to think, well, what happens if someone gets hold of it? If someone gets hold of it and can use it, that's a problem, because it's like stealing a cookie, right? So if you think about how we handle cookies in the wild, if a cookie stores something like your logged in session state, we're careful to send those tokens, those cookies, over HTTPS to stop an unscrupulous person grabbing that cookie but now sort of acting as you as in a logged in state. And so we run cookies with information like that only over HTTPS to make sure they can't be stolen. The same thinking needs to be applied to JWT tokens. Now, if you are not sending JWT tokens over a transport which is already encrypted and protected in some way, then you will want to necessarily encrypt it yourself. But if your communication between, say, your client and server is already maybe running over something like TLS, then you don't necessarily need to encrypt the cookie as well, because the cookie itself is flowing over that HTTPS transport. You still would, of course, want to be generating the hash and validating the token. So a lot of it is going to be based on how you're sending that JWT token, and the question raised is also, how much you trust the transport mechanism being used to send that cookie around. And so you really get to dive into the details of the transport you're using. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, so let's push on now. Other things to think about in terms of monitoring. I know many of you are going to be making use of cloud vendors and things like that. I think it's often a problem that we sort of fixate on IP-based security detection. Reality is a large amount of how we set up and deploy and manage our systems are done through APIs. And so you can't necessarily just always look at the running network stack of your system to see, is there something odd going on? You actually need to look at sort of how your system is set up and how your accounts and things are managed. What permissions are you giving to people? What permissions have different processes got? Does a user have access to things they shouldn't have access to on your cloud platform, for example? And so it becomes a much wider thing to get a sense of who has access to our systems. Luckily, some of the main cloud vendors have got really good at this over the last few years. For example, it's very easy for you to log in to your AWS cloud and see what users are doing what things. That can be very useful to help you tighten the policies they have and reduce the access. This is actually from one of my test accounts, so I can see what my my developer user has been doing and what they haven't been doing. And you can take a quick look at this and see, are these users doing odd things? Azure has very similar capabilities and support, the ability to actually see if users are doing odd things. These things can be programmatically accessed. You can actually add alerting and fault detection mechanisms can run off the back of these things, looking for odd usage patterns and things like that as well. Looking at it again from a microservices point of view, another thing that gets talked about a lot is this idea of polyglot services. This idea that you can have lots of different technologies to implement your services, and people like this choice. But the problem is, though, that the idea is, okay, well, let's try rewriting this service enclosure, right? It's all going to be better, and that option, the ability to do that, can be really beneficial, right? It can be great from a culture point of view. It can help you use new technology more quickly, but it does come at a bit of a cost. For example, you've got way more stuff to keep on top of, right? You have to keep your application patched. You have to keep your service patched. It's not just the operating system it runs on, it's actually your application code itself. Now here, tools are really getting better. I'm a big fan of a tool called Snyk. So Snyk will just look at the dependencies of your system, of your application code, and will tell you when your libraries are out of date. It will even send you pull requests to automatically update the versions of libraries you depend upon. And so I'd say if you are building a polyglot microservice type architecture, when you've got lots of different technology stacks, I would absolutely take a look at something like Snyk or a similar tool to actually automate the process of making sure at least your application code is patched and up to date. There's another side to polyglot, and this is this give and take, is that fact is that with polyglot, you've got a sort of a much wider plurality of technology, and that can be really useful because an exploit that might say work against your Java-based services wouldn't necessarily work against your Ruby-based services, and so you might be less vulnerable to, say, a catastrophic zero-day exploit that hits, for example, a certain version of the JVM you're using, or whatever version of Ruby you're using. you've got a mix of technologies, you might actually have some benefits. Again, I think a team that's set up that's got a high degree of rigor around automation, that's automating the patching of both their their container operating systems, their host operating systems, and their application code. For them, I think the use of Polyglot may actually be a benefit from the point of view of security. But a naive approach, lots of different technology stacks, you're not really keeping up to speed with the latest patches that are being released. You don't even know if things are being patched. You might be more vulnerable to some of the exploits out there. And a lot of the exploits that get used, that get run on unpatched vulnerabilities, are often untargeted as well. So we've blazed through prevention and detection. Let's take a quick pass through looking through response. And here, this is all about what you do when something bad has happened, right? We've done our best to stop it from happening. We've found out that something bad's happened, and now we've got to deal with that situation. And actually, there's actually loads and loads of great examples of what not to do after a security breach. One of my famous examples is the Target breach from many years ago. And this is a nasty exploit where a malicious party installed some malware onto the till system at Target. So Target is a big box retailer in the US. Some huge proportion of the US public shop at Target, and their tills became infected with this malware. This malware was actually memory resident malware that was sniffing credit card details as they were being swiped at the tills, and it then exfiltrated that data. So it took all that data out, sent it off to the dark web, where it was sold for lots of money. Now, the really interesting thing about this was that Target found out that this was happening. In fact, they had a team internally inside Target, and at the time they were one of the very few big retailers in the US that had their own dedicated internal IT security team, and they spotted this malware being installed and spotted this malware being used, and they'd raised the alert. Unfortunately, that alert wasn't taken seriously internally, and it was only until they realized the scale of what had happened and were actually shamed into announcing it that happened that all this stuff came to light. The CEO at Target actually ended up losing their jobs over all of this. And it's just this, you see this thing time and time again, you try and deny anything's happening, deny it, and then you sort of make the story much bigger than it needs to be. The Target story is so interesting, partly because they saw it happening and knew it was happening and didn't do anything about it. And that makes them quite unique in some ways. If you want to know more about this, I can thoroughly recommend the reporting done by Brian Krebs. You go to Krebs on Security, it's really, really interesting stuff. So yeah, definitely do take a look at that. There's loads of counter examples here. A lot of the issue really all comes down to this. It comes down to communication. When you're responding to what happens after an attack, the issue is you're trying to work out what you're to do. You're trying to work out what to say, who to communicate with. And the issue is you're probably not thinking clearly at the time, because at that point you are in panic mode. And you see so many organizations do silly things in panic mode. And it actually starts with just some very, very basic ways of operating, basic ways of thinking. I would suggest it would be really the best time to think about what you would do if an attack happened or if some security breach was discovered. The best time to think about what you should do is when there isn't one happening. So actually now, right, if today's nice and calm, sit down as a group, say, okay, what would we do? Let's come up with some scenarios of what's happened. What would we do? Okay, in this situation, who's going to send the contact to our customers? Which customers get contacted? Who's that email coming from? What does that email say? What tone does that email strike? Let's actually draft that email now. Let's draft that email and have it ready to go, and have a playbook of these are the things that are going to happen when a security incident occurs. And do that when things are quiet. Do that when you can think clearly, because then when the shit hits the fan, and you need to pull out your manual, you can run through those steps that have been thought about clearly, and you can actually make a sensible decision about what to do next. Okay, let's take a look at, lastly, let's take a look at recovery. So with recovery, we've hopefully responded, we've thought about what it is we want to do. But we've now got to pick up the pieces. We've got to get our system back up and running. And so what's the best way to get things back up and running? Well, actually, in a lot of cases, it's counterintuitively, it's to burn it all down. Why do I say that? Well, the issue is that once you've discovered that something bad has happened, that somebody's gained access to your systems. At that point, you can't necessarily trust your systems anymore. Some of the attacks that my own systems have been hit with have been quite insidious. Like you see the obvious things that they've left lying around, but they've done more insidious things. Like on one of the rootkits I got hit with, the rootkit had actually patched ls, the list command, to not show the files in the rootkit. It had patched ps, so I'd never see their processes again. And so I can try and stop and close off the user they were using or anything else, but I don't know they've not left little things lying around. Some of the most serious security breaches that we see are caused by things called advanced persistent threats. These are people or attacks that have been in your system for a long period of time and have gained access to a large amount of data. And often advanced persistent threats are allowed to persist because people mistakenly think they've cleaned them out when they're discovered. Often the best thing to do is torch a whole system and build it up again from scratch. The reason we don't do this is because still too many of us consider our systems and our services something akin to snowflakes. Like, this is my own special computer. I built it. It is unique amongst the world. There are no other computers like this. And that's partly because we have no idea how it was created and no idea how to recreate it. Because we build up the state of a running server over a whole series of manual commands that have been run over years and years and years. That makes it very hard to reproduce the state of a running process or a running system. So if I want to rebuild it, it's always a really fraught exercise. You don't know if it's going to work or not. Now, many of us, and I'm sure many of you on this call, have actually made use of things like infrastructure automation tools. This is an example of some Ansible scripts I use for one of my setups, right? So here I can actually be setting up in text files the state of a machine, the state of a process. And these text files can be stored in source control. They can be run in a repeatable fashion, in a fully automated fashion. This drastically reduces the amount of time it takes to rebuild a given machine. These processes are repeatable. They're actually easy to audit. I can see the changes that have been made. They're also declarative in nature, which actually makes repeatedly running these things so much easier. You can take these ideas further, of course, and stop allowing any manual change to be made on those machines too, making it much easier to make sure that the stuff that's checked into source code is actually what's going to build your machines. So this process of sort of rapidly rebuilding machines from source code is something that actually most people I know who build microservice systems do as part of their traditional CI/CD deployment processes anyway. That means that if a bad security problem hits, they can actually safely torch their systems and rebuild everything from scratch. And actually, this is one of the best things you can do in terms of making your systems more robust and easier to rebuild after security incidents, is getting it to be to the point where you can automatically rebuild everything from scratch from an audited source control repository. This stuff is really incredibly useful. Oh, I've just lost my cursor. Sorry. So I've got a little bit long, so I'll just sum up. So we've talked a bit about prevention, how to stop a bad thing from happening. Detection, how do I know if a bad thing has happened? Response, what do you do next? And so how do you deal with this? What's the thing you do in the immediate aftermath? And recovery, how do you pick up the pieces? Now, in the course that Jamie mentioned at the beginning, I go into a lot more detail. We spent a whole day on this topic, and I've given you about 35 minutes. So, in this course, we'll talk about things like what this slide means, and we'll be exploring things like service meshes that can be really beneficial. If you are interested in coming along to that, there are loads more details up on the Container Solutions website. And we're running courses on the 19th and 20th in Amsterdam, the 22nd and 23rd in London. If you attended and signed up for this webinar, you'll get 20% off, so that should help. This course is like a double header. So as I said, I'm doing the architecture side of things. Adrian is just taking those ideas, and you're actually doing some hands-on stuff, protecting and securing Docker. And then you get day of me and a day of Adrian. So you get sort of from high-level concept all the way through to detailed implementation. It's like full stack security in a way. So I hope this course has been useful. You can get more information and contact me at my website, samnewman.io. I've had a couple of questions come in. I'll just answer very quickly. If you've got any more questions, just use the question widget on the GoToWebinar control panel. So a question here is, how would I manage private keys when using client certificate authentication and scaling multiple instances of the same, more keys or copying the keys? There are different, to be honest with you, whether or not you have the same key duplicated or different keys, The real issue is how do you get the key out there in the first place? So you need some mechanism to deploy that key and revoke that key and reissue those keys. So in the past, I've used systems like Puppet or Chef to push that information out, and some of them, both Puppet and Chef, though, their server stacks have sort of secrets mechanisms for pushing out secure pieces of data like this. Increasingly, though, I tend to start looking at things like Vault from HashiCorp. So Vault is a very effective system for deploying secrets. It can be really useful for actually distributing and revoking API keys and even issuing time-limited API keys. With a system like that in place, you're able to actually get a lot more fine-grained in how you issue them. The trade-off here really is if I give the same key to everybody, and then that key is being used in an incorrect way, and I have to revoke that key, that's got a large impact. If I give people different keys, not only can I scope what those keys do, but I can also limit the impact of revoking those keys. On the other hand, if the mechanism for deploying that key and managing that key is a manual process, I'm probably not going to want loads of them. So that's the sort of trade-off you've got. But the more you've got a system that allows you to automatically deploy and push those keys out, something like HashiCorp Vault or some of the parameter store stuff in AWS can be made to do this as well. The more you're going to be able to be much more flexible and much more nuanced in how you make use of those sorts of keys and things. So I hope that was useful. All right, so I'm just going to pause, understand line for another couple of minutes. If anyone's got any other questions, please just do answer via the widget or contact me on Twitter. But thank you very much for your time. Jamie, over to you.
No, I think that's it, Sam. Thank you for your excellent webinar. I think the questions were really good and really positive response from everybody. Unless there are any more questions, I think it's going to be goodbye from Sam. And it's going to be goodbye.
I missed that whole two Ronnies thing there. Sorry, mate.
Non-English people wouldn't get it anyway. Okay, let's try that again. It's going to be goodbye from Sam.
And it's going to be goodbye from Jamie.
Goodbye, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Richarlison, University Challenge? No.